this is the biggest jump. Here's the spending one. That's the biggest jump that occurs on any kind of regulation that I've seen looking at these kind of numbers. Again, most of that surge is the federalization of the screening workforce at airports. But we have also had, after 9/11, a pretty decent-sized ramp-up in security-related regulations as well, where either new regulations came into existence or things that were previously regulated for security purposes, regulations got tighter. You get the same kind of pattern when you look at Homeland Security regulatory personnel. Notice the last few years. Because the last few years, actually, what's the last year marked on? Last year marked on there is 2010. So the last year represents basically a projection in the Obama administration's recent budget, the budget that it proposed earlier this year. And notice essentially what the administration is saying is that, it looks like Homeland Security related activity is going to continue to rise, although not at as fast a pace as under Bush. So it looks like this one, it was not just some anomaly that happened under Bush and then it's going to drop back down again. It looks like this is here to stay. Big trend number 4. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because I have a number of great colleagues at the Mercatus Center who have done research on this, and one who even spent some time in the federal government trying to do something about it. Midnight regulation. There are various ways of measuring this, but the general phenomenon is this. There is a tendency for regulatory activity on the federal level to get concentrated in the final quarter of a president's final year in office. Hence the term midnight regulation. Because a lot of it happens after the election, before Inauguration Day. And this is consistent across Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, so it's not a partisan thing at all. It tends to be stronger either at the end of a president who served 8 years, because the president's really a lame duck and won't be serving again, or when control of the presidency is switching from one party to another. So, for example, we got, I think the term midnight regulation may have been coined during the Carter administration, but here, if I'm lining up my numbers correctly, I think this is our peak under the Carter administration over here. That would be our peak under the Carter administration. We have, okay, here's at the end of the first Reagan administration. Notice there isn't much regulatory activity between Reagan's first and second term, and there wasn't a lot of midnight activity between Clinton's first and second term. There wasn't a lot of midnight activity between Bush's first and second term, but everybody seems to have this kind of thing at the end of the term. It's not necessarily good or bad. I mean, the real issue is, are they issuing good, well-thought-out regulations, or are they not issuing good, well-thought-out regulations when they're doing a lot of this toward the end of the term? In theory, it could be either. There are some arguments that trying to do a whole lot in that short period of time it may be a bad thing for 2 reasons. One is because since most of that activity is occurring between Election Day and Inauguration Day, that's at a point where the outgoing president really isn't accountable to anybody for what he's doing. And so from a democratic perspective, you have to wonder, do you really want new surges, big new surges of activity in an administration when it's very clear the president is leaving office and can kind of do whatever he wants and faces no kind of penalty from the electorate for it. The other reason we might want to think carefully about whether midnight regulation is a good idea is because of this internal review function that I mentioned earlier, that in executive branch agencies, regulations are supposed to be reviewed at the Office of Management and Budget, and they're supposed to be analyzed pretty carefully to make sure that agencies understand the costs and understand the benefits. If agencies are trying to do a lot of stuff at the same time, that means agencies may not be thinking as carefully about what they're doing, and it means that the reviewers in the administration are swamped with a lot of work at the same time, where they may not be able to think carefully about it as they normally would. And one way of trying to look at that and measure that is to compare 2 things. One is, really big regulations that have a lot of effect are referred to in federal regulatory parlance as economically significant regulations. That's regulations that have an economic impact of more than $100 million, either costs or benefits, or federal spending. Economically significant regulations. You can count the number of economically significant regulations issued in the last quarter of every year, and we find once again evidence of this midnight phenomenon. Here's the midnight regulations at the end of who would that be? Bush 1. Here's the midnight regulations at the end of Clinton. Here's the midnight regulations at the end of Bush 2. We only have the figures since 1981 because it was Reagan's executive order that created the classification called economically significant regulations, so they've only been tracked that long. You see this big spike in economically significant regulations at the end of these presidential terms, and if you look at the resources available in the office that's supposed to review these regulations for the president, you find the budget of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs has pretty much declined steadily from around $10, no, not $10, I think that's going to be about $10 million back in 1981. It grew a little bit under Reagan because Reagan was big on this kind of review. But it's bounced around, but it's gradually dropped, increased a bit under Bush. But in general, you have kind of declining resources to review regulations, and the number of people in that office is fairly constant in any given year. But then you have these big spikes in one quarter, where you got to think, the people who are supposed to review these regulations for the president just can't be able to spend as much time on each economically significant regulation during the midnight period as they spend any other time, because there's just a lot more regulations then. So it's quite possible that midnight regulations, or maybe there's less democratic accountability to the electorate for them, and they may not be thought through as carefully. One little footnote. You notice that under Bush 2, the amount of midnight regulation seems to be lower than under Clinton or Bush 1. A big part of that reason is because the White House Chief of Staff, Josh Bolten, had issued a memo toward the end of the administration telling federal agencies that we're not going to have any of this midnight regulation stuff, and so if you want to propose new regulations, you need to have your homework done by June in order to be able to put regulations out that you want to finish by the end of the presidential term. So it looks like what happened in the second Bush administration is they smoothed it out a little bit and pushed some of that regulatory activity back into summer and into spring of the election year, rather than having it all happen at the end of the election year. And have to give credit to my wonderful former colleague at the Mercatus Center, Susan Dudley, who headed the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs for the last 2 years of the administration, and she had written a lot on midnight regulation and went in very, very committed to trying to reduce the effect of this midnight regulation. Okay, big trend number 5, and I don't think I have any. No, I don't have any pictures for this one. Big trend number 5 is we will see, or we're likely to see, an increase in regulation of financial companies as a result of the recent financial crisis. And the important thing to keep in mind about this is there's going to be 2 kinds of regulation of financial companies. Some of it will actually be related to things that people think might have caused the financial crisis. So, for example, there are contracts called credit default swaps, which are essentially a way of buying insurance when you own a portfolio of mortgages. A credit default swap allows you to lay off some of the risk that those mortgages will default. Some people think that those played a role in the financial crisis. There have been moves to require that all of these credit